It began with small signs. My son looked pale. He complained of pain. His body weakened. At first I thought it was stress, maybe exhaustion from work. But then the fever came, the vomiting, the way his skin seemed to lose all color. I rushed him to the hospital, my heart pounding, fear clawing at my chest. I sat in the waiting room while doctors ran tests. Every second felt like a knife, cutting deeper into my soul. He was my only son, the boy I had carried, fed, protected. Watching him struggle to breathe tore me apart. When the doctor finally returned, his face was serious. I gripped my chair tighter. I knew before he spoke that the news would change everything. The hospital room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how tightly you fold your arms. I sat on the edge of the chair, my eyes fixed on the white door, as if staring hard enough would make the doctor return sooner. The seconds stretched into minutes, and every tick of the clock above my head made my heart pound faster. Finally, the door opened. The doctor entered with a folder in his hand. His face was calm but serious, the kind of expression that tells you before a single word is spoken that your life is about to change. He sat across from me, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "Your son's condition is very severe. His kidneys have failed. He cannot survive much longer without a transplant." The words struck me like thunder. For a moment, I could not even breathe. My ears rang, as if the world around me had gone silent, leaving only those words echoing inside my head. Cannot survive without a transplant. I leaned forward, desperate, clinging to any hope. "Doctor, please, tell me, what can we do? Where will we find a kidney?" He sighed, his eyes softening. "Finding a donor is not easy. The waiting list is long, sometimes months, sometimes years, and your son does not have that much time. His body is weakening quickly. If we cannot arrange a kidney soon, I'm afraid." His voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Tears burned in my eyes. I turned to look at my son through the glass window. He lay on the bed, pale and fragile, tubes running into his arm, machines beeping steadily beside him. My strong, bright boy reduced to this fragile figure struggling for life. The doctor's voice pulled me back. "There is one option. Family members are sometimes the best donors. If you are willing, we can test your compatibility. But it must be soon. Every day counts." I did not hesitate. My answer came from the deepest part of my soul, faster than thought. "Take mine. Take my kidney. If it will save him, I'll give it today." The doctor looked surprised, almost as if he had expected me to pause, to question, to think of myself. But how could I? This was my son, my blood, my life. What was a kidney compared to his future? He nodded gently. "We will run the tests. If you are a match, we can proceed with surgery, but you must understand, this is not without risk. Giving away a kidney will affect your health. You may not recover fully. It will weaken you." I wiped my tears with the back of my hand. What is a mother's health compared to her child's life? "Do whatever you must. Just save him." The doctor placed a hand on mine, perhaps in respect, perhaps in pity. "Very well, we will prepare the tests immediately." As he left the room, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer. "Take anything from me, God, but don't take my son. If my body can give him life again, then let it be so. Let me suffer, but let him live." I knew in that moment that my decision was final. My son's survival would come before everything, before my health, before my comfort, before myself. I was ready to sacrifice. When the tests began, every moment felt like an ocean tide pulling me under, then pushing me up again. The hospital staff moved with efficient calm. A phlebotomist with gentle hands took vials of blood. A lab technician explained the tissue typing, and a nurse measured my blood pressure, as if I were both fragile and fierce. Each beep and each label mattered like a prayer. The possibility of saving my son balanced on these small, clinical acts. I remember sitting in that cold consultation room while the doctor reviewed the first results. "You're a potential match," he said, almost as if speaking about whether. His voice held relief, but it was measured. He was trained not to give false hope. "We need to run a few more compatibility tests and do a full medical evaluation to make sure you can safely donate. If all goes well, we can schedule surgery within the week." Relief was a wild animal inside me, trying to leap up and tear at my chest. I wanted to laugh and cry in the same breath. "Do it," I told him, my voice steady though my fingers trembled around my prayer beads. "Do whatever is needed. My son must live." Preparing for surgery felt surreal. Nurses explained risks, infection, bleeding, the fatigue that could linger for months, possible complications. A social worker talked to me about consent forms and about recovery time. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, the question itself, a kind of kindness, an invitation to think of myself. I wanted to tell her that I had thought about nothing else my whole life but this child's safety. Instead, I nodded and signed where she pointed, each signature an offering. On the morning of the operation, the hospital felt thin and luminous, as if a hush had settled in the corridors. I held my son's hand through the glass for as long as I could. His eyelids fluttered. He whispered my name, and the sound was all the answer I needed. "Mama," he breathed, in a voice like distant thunder. "I'm scared." The child in him reached out, and the mother and me wrapped him in resolve. They wheeled me into the pre-op room. The anesthetist smiled, professional and kind, and explained how I would be sedated. The surgeon, a tall, precise woman with a calm face, reviewed the procedure once more, and then rested a steadying hand on my arm. "We do everything we can," she said. "You are in strong hands." As they began the anesthesia, the world softened to edges. I remember the feeling of detachment, the coolness like the surface of a lake spreading, then darkness. In the space before sleep, 1,000 images flickered, my son's first steps, the time he fell and I soothed him, the nights I had stayed awake sewing instead of resting so he could have a new school uniform. Each memory felt like a bead strung on a cord of purpose. Surgery is an odd, sacred thing, metal and light, human hands and humming machines. I drifted and woke at intervals, an odd awareness of voices and the smell of antiseptic. When I came fully to myself, the first face I saw was the surgeon's, tired but gentle. "The transplant went well," she said. "We had no major complications. He's stable in recovery. You will be monitored closely." Relief surged through me like heat. I felt exhausted down to the marrow, but the weight of that exhaustion was tempered by a fierce, steady joy. The days after were slow and tender. Pain came in waves, sharp in the incision, dull and persistent in the muscles that had been stretched and soothed. Nurses taught me how to breathe, to cough, to move so the lungs would stay clear. I learned the peculiar gratitude of small comforts, a warm washcloth, a cup of tea, the simple pleasure of being helped to the bathroom by a gentle hand. My son opened his eyes in the recovery room and looked at me with a face newly lit, like dawn. The first time he attempted to sit up, he coughed and grinned and croaked, "Mama, feel better." Tears blurred my vision, then tears of pain, relief, and the strange joy that comes from finding a life you thought you might lose. Visiting hours blurred into weeks. The staff encouraged us, so we walking a little farther, eating a little more. My son's color returned. The machines that had once beeped with worry dwindled to quiet monitors. Annie began speaking of plans he had shelved, work tasks he wanted to return to, a friend he wanted to call, a dish he wanted to cook again. With each day, my soul settled into the small blessings of recovery. I had given something essential, and life, in a quiet, stubborn way, was returning. Yet the doctor's warnings lingered at the edge. "You will need rest," the surgeon had told me in a quiet voice as she examined my incision. "Your remaining kidney will work, but you must take care of your health. Monitor blood pressure, avoid heavy lifting, attend regular checks." I nodded, understanding in my bones. But then life has its own tides and obligations pressed. I promised myself I would slow down, that this gift would not be wasted by carelessness. I vowed to protect the life that had been returned to my son. In the weeks after discharge, I watched him grow stronger. He laughed at small things again, his voice richer, his steps surer. The neighbors noticed, too. They congratulated me and praised the doctors. There was a fragile happiness in the house once more. Meals shared at the table, small jokes, a brightness in the windows. I held that joy like a fragile bird, carefully, reverently, knowing how quickly storms could come. And yet, through the warmth of recovery, a shadow gathered quietly. Small health complaints I attributed to surgery and healing, fatigue that lingered longer than expected, infections that took time to treat, dizziness that rose without warning. I thought each was temporary, and for a while they seemed to be. I told myself, perhaps selfishly, this is the price to pay, a small toll on my body for the life of my child. I was still grateful, still proud of what I had done. When he reached for my hand across the table and said, "Mama, you saved me," the words were simple and clean, and they filled me. But even in that fullness, a small whisper of worry sometimes curled at the edge of my joy, a hint that all gifts have consequences, that love given without guard can carry cost as well as grace. That worry was only a whisper then. The days of bright recovery beat loudly enough to drown it. For now, the house hummed with life reclaimed. I slept with the faint ache of my incision, and a heart full of relief. I had given a part of myself, and in return, the man who had once been a child in my arms smiled again. The world felt, for a moment, right. The hospital corridors seemed less threatening once the surgery was done. Where before every step echoed like a warning, now the walls carried a different sound, the steady rhythm of healing. My son was no longer the fragile boy gasping for life. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes, though still tired, held a spark I had feared I might never see again. I remember the first time he stood up from his bed, the nurses supporting him on both sides. His legs shook, his face twisted in pain, but when he managed to step forward, he looked at me and whispered, "Mama, I'm walking again." That moment was worth every cut on my skin, every ache in my bones. My body had been torn, but my soul felt mended. As for me, recovery was slower. My wound burned with each movement, and fatigue pressed on me like an invisible weight. Yet, I pushed through it, clinging to the joy of watching my son get stronger. When he laughed at a joke from a nurse, I laughed too, even though it hurt to do so. His smile became my medicine. When the doctors finally discharged us, neighbors gathered to welcome him home. They congratulated him on his health, clapped him on the back, and told him how lucky he was. I stood in the background, my hand on my abdomen, my steps slow, but my heart swelling with pride. They called him a survivor, but I knew in my heart the truth. I had given him my strength, my blood, my life. At first, he seemed grateful. "Mama," he told me one night, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, "I can never repay you. You gave me life twice." I reached out and stroked his hair like I used to when he was a boy. "You don't need to repay me," I whispered. "Just live well. That will be enough." But the body remembers what the heart tries to forget. Each week, my son's energy grew, while mine seemed to drain away. Walking up the stairs left me breathless. Cooking a meal made my hands tremble. Some nights, dizziness overtook me so suddenly I had to grip the wall to keep from falling. The doctor's warnings returned to me then, echoing like a prophecy. "You may not recover fully. It will weaken you." Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to darken my son's happiness with my struggles. He was smiling again, planning his future again, and I convinced myself that was worth any price. If I had to live with pain and weakness, so be it. A mother's sacrifice is not measured in comfort but in her child's laughter. And so I carried on, telling myself this was temporary, that strength would return in time. But deep inside, a shadow was growing, one that neither of us could ignore forever. At first, I told myself the weakness was only temporary. Surgery takes time, I thought. My body would heal, and strength would return. But as weeks turned into months, the shadow of exhaustion grew heavier. Simple tasks that once felt effortless became mountains. Carrying laundry left me trembling. Climbing the stairs forced me to pause, clutching the railing as though the steps might swallow me whole. My chest burned when I walked too fast, and some nights I woke breathless, drenched in cold sweat. I tried to hide it. A mother never wants to burden her child, especially after he has suffered so much. So I smiled when he asked if I was all right, and I laughed off the dizziness as if it were nothing more than age. But truth cannot be disguised forever. He began to notice the way I leaned on walls, the way my hands shook when pouring tea, the way I spent longer hours resting instead of cooking or cleaning. At first, his concern was genuine. "Mama, are you sure you're okay?" he asked one evening, his eyes soft with worry. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Don't worry about me. You're the one who needs to stay strong." But as his strength returned, as his body became whole again, that concern faded. Gratitude was slowly replaced by irritation. Where once he had spoken gently, now his voice carried impatience. "Why are you always lying down?" he asked one afternoon when he came home and found me resting. "Other mothers your age manage fine. You can't keep being so weak." His words stung, but I swallowed the pain. He didn't understand, how could he? He had gained life from my body, while mine had been left half empty. Still, I said nothing. I reminded myself of the promise I had made in the hospital. Let me suffer, but let him live. But the suffering grew. My body, once resilient, felt like it was betraying me. Even holding a grocery bag made my arms ache. I started missing meals, not out of choice but because my stomach churned too often. Nights were the worst. I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ache in my side sharp and unforgiving. And through it all, my son grew stronger, taller in his confidence, busier in his routines. He laughed with his friends, went out to dinners, lived the life I had prayed he would live. But in that laughter, I began to feel the sharp edge of distance. He no longer looked at me as his savior, the mother who had given him life twice. He began to see me as something else. A burden. And deep down, though I tried to deny it, I felt the shift coming like a storm gathering at the horizon. The change came quietly at first, like whispers behind doors, like shadows stretching across the floor when the sun begins to set. My son's tone grew sharper, not openly cruel yet, but lined with irritation that stung sharper than any wound. One evening, as I slowly prepared dinner, my hands trembling from the effort of chopping vegetables, he sighed heavily behind me. "Mama, why does everything take you so long now? Before surgery you could cook in half the time. Now you're always so slow." I froze, the knife trembling in my hand. I wanted to remind him that my body was not the same anymore, that I had given him a part of myself so that he could live. But the words caught in my throat. Gratitude had faded from his eyes, replaced by expectation, as though saving his life had been only my duty, and now my weakness was an inconvenience. Days passed, and the complaints grew louder. He began to comment on the house. "Why is the laundry piling up? Why is the floor not clean? Why can't you manage small things anymore?" Each word felt like a slap, sharper than the scalpel that had cut me open. When his wife joined him, the atmosphere shifted from irritation to hostility. She sneered at me openly, her words dripping with contempt. "You're always lying around, coughing, complaining. You gave one kidney, and act like you've sacrificed the world. Other people live perfectly fine after surgery. Why can't you?" Her words sliced deeper than his. She had not seen me signing the consent forms with trembling hands. She had not felt the anesthesia take me into the dark, or the pain of waking with half my strength gone. She had not watched me struggle to breathe some nights, afraid that my only kidney might fail. And yet, she spoke as if my sacrifice were nothing. One night, when my body ached so much I could not rise from bed, I overheard them speaking in the living room. Their voices carried through the thin walls. "She's always sick," my son's wife said coldly. "Every day it's something: fatigue, pain, dizziness. I didn't marry you to spend my life caring for an old woman." My son's voice was low, almost reluctant, but it pierced me all the same. "I know. She wasn't like this before. It's getting worse." A silence followed, then her voice again, sharper this time. "Then do something about it. She's becoming a burden. We can't live like this forever." I lay in my bed, tears soaking my pillow, my heart heavier than my aching body. I had given him life twice, once when I brought him into this world, and again when I gave him my kidney. And now, instead of gratitude, I was being discussed like unwanted furniture, something in the way, something disposable. It was in that moment I realized, love and sacrifice, no matter how deep, can be twisted by ingratitude. My son's laughter was back, his health restored, but his heart had turned colder than ever before. And I knew, sooner or later, the storm would break. It happened one afternoon, on a day when my body was weaker than usual. I had tried to sweep the floor, but halfway through, dizziness washed over me. My breath came short, and I lowered myself slowly onto the chair, clutching the broom for balance. Sweat dampened my forehead, though the air was cool. My son entered the room just then. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might notice my struggle, ask if I needed water, or sit beside me like the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees. Instead, he frowned at the half-clean floor. "Again, Mama?" His tone was sharp, frustrated. "Always tired, always weak. What's the point if you can't even do basic things anymore?" I lifted my eyes to him, my voice trembling. "Son, you know why. I gave you my kidney. My health hasn't been the same since then." He turned away, shaking his head. "Don't keep repeating that. You chose to do it. I didn't force you." The words hit me like a stone in the chest. I didn't force you. Was that all my sacrifice meant to him? A choice that absolved him of gratitude? My lips parted, but before I could speak, his wife entered. She crossed her arms, her eyes hard. "She's right, you know," she said, glaring at me. "You act like we owe you everything because of that surgery. But the truth is, we're the ones taking care of you now. You're always sick, always lying down. This house feels like a hospital because of you." Tears welled in my eyes. I whispered, "I gave you life. Twice. Once when you were born, and once when you were dying. And now, this is how you speak to me." My son's face twisted, a storm of emotions passing through it: guilt, anger, perhaps shame. But in the end, it was cruelty that won. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Enough. I can't live like this anymore. You're not my savior. You're a burden, always sick, always complaining. Why should I suffer because you can't handle your own body? The silence after his words was louder than thunder. My tears spilled freely, but I stayed seated, too weak to rise, too broken to defend myself. In that moment, the room seemed smaller, darker. The boy I had once rocked to sleep, the man whose life I had saved, now looked at me as if I were nothing but dead weight, dragging him down. That night, lying in my bed, I replayed his words again and again. A burden, a burden, a burden. They echoed in my mind like a curse, tearing at the very fabric of my heart. I realized then that my son's cruelty was not an accident of anger. It was the truth he carried inside the truth. He no longer cared to hide, and the storm I had feared was no longer on the horizon. It was here, in my own house, roaring in his voice. The breaking point came on a rainy evening. The sky outside was dark, the kind of storm where raindrops strike the windows like fists, and thunder shakes the walls. I was sitting quietly in the corner of the living room, a shawl wrapped around my shoulders, my body aching with fatigue. The air was damp, my chest tight, but I tried to stay silent, hoping not to invite another quarrel. My son and his wife entered together, their footsteps heavy, their voices low at first, but then her words rose, sharp enough to cut through the sound of the storm. "I've had enough," she snapped. "Every day, it's the same. She's sick, she's lying around, she's coughing. This isn't a home anymore, it's a burden. Either she goes, or I go." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My son glanced at me briefly, then looked back at her. I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the battle between blood and convenience. For one fragile moment, I prayed he would defend me, stand by me, but then his shoulders slumped, and his voice fell like a knife. "Mama," he said, not meeting my eyes, "you can't stay here anymore. You've become too much. We can't live like this." The words sliced through me. My shawl slipped from my shoulders as I struggled to stand. "Son," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I gave you my kidney. I gave you my life so you could live. And now, you ask me to leave." He turned away, unable to face me. His wife, emboldened, stepped forward and shouted, "Yes, leave. This is our home now. We don't need your sickness poisoning our lives." I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the chair for balance. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. Rain lashed the windows as if the heavens themselves mourned with me. My son finally looked at me, his face hard. "Mama, please, just go. I can't take this anymore." Tears streamed down my face, but no words came. Slowly, painfully, I gathered the few belongings I had left: a small bag of clothes, some photographs, and the prayer beads I had carried through every storm of my life. I looked at him one last time, my vision blurred by grief. "One day," I whispered, "you will understand the weight of what you've done. And that day, these words will haunt you." Without another glance, I walked out into the storm. The door closed behind me with a final, echoing thud. The rain soaked through my clothes as I stepped into the night, each drop mingling with my tears. I had given my son life twice, and now, he had taken mine away, casting me into the cold world as though I were nothing. It was not just betrayal. It was the death of everything I had once believed about love, loyalty, and family. The rain did not stop that night. It poured as though the sky itself grieved for me, drenching my thin clothes, chilling me to the bone. My small bag grew heavy on my shoulder, and with each step, the water seeped into my shoes until my feet ached. The streets, glistening under the dim street lights, stretched endlessly ahead of me. I wandered without direction, my body trembling from weakness and heartbreak. Every corner I turned, I prayed for shelter, for some doorway or bench that would let me rest. But people closed their doors quickly when they saw me, just an old, sick woman with wet hair clinging to her face, carrying nothing but sorrow. Finally, I found a bus stop with a roof. I sat on the cold metal bench, my bag at my feet, and pulled my shawl tightly around me, though it was soaked through. The city bustled on, cars rushing past, strangers hurrying by with umbrellas, none of them sparing me a second glance. I was invisible, just as I had been in my own son's home. The hours dragged on, my stomach growled with hunger, but I had nothing to eat. My throat burned from thirst, but the only water was the rain that dripped from the roof. My body ached in every joint. My scar pulled sharply whenever I shifted. I pressed my palm against my side, whispering to myself, "You are strong. You survived worse. You will not break tonight." Days blurred into each other. Sometimes kind strangers dropped coins into my hand. Once, a woman from a bakery gave me a stale loaf of bread and said softly, "God bless you." Another time, a man shoved me away from the bench, muttering that I was blocking his path. I learned quickly that pity was rare and cruelty was common. Nights were the hottest. The city grew quieter, darker, and colder. I huddled under stairwells or in doorways, praying no one would drive me away. I watched the stars above, hidden behind clouds, and wondered if my husband, long gone, could see me from wherever he rested. Sometimes I whispered his name into the night, begging for strength. What cut deepest was not the hunger, not the cold, not even the pain of my failing health. It was the memory of my son's voice, his words still sharp in my ears. "You're a burden. Please, just go." I replayed them over and over, each time feeling the knife twist deeper. Yet even in those darkest nights, a small flame inside me refused to die. I reminded myself, I am not just a burden. I am a mother. I gave him life twice. The world may forget, he may forget, but my sacrifice is real. And one day, that truth will return to me. It was that thought, a whisper of hope, that kept me alive through the cruel, endless days on the street. And soon, fate would send me someone who would not turn away. I had stopped expecting kindness. When you live long enough in other people's shadows, you learn the economy of care, small courtesies, quick glances, a nod, and then the world moves on. So when the woman first sat beside me beneath the awning of the clinic, I thought she would pass, like all the others, offer a plastic cup of coffee, a sympathetic smile, then walk away. She did not. She introduced herself without ceremony. "My name is Aisha," she said, voice steady, her coat damp from the drizzle. "I volunteer at the hospital's transplant follow-up unit. I saw a note about a discharged donor matching your description. Are you Odessa?" Her eyes were kind but focused, the way people look when they are used to listening to hard stories and need to find facts between the lines. I told her the truth slowly, because the story still felt like a wound too raw to be flung around. I spoke of the wedding slap, of the cold words my son had used, of the night the door had closed behind me, and the rain had soaked my back as if the world itself were shaming me. I told her, haltingly, about the surgery, how I had lain under a harsh light and given one of my kidneys to my son. I described the hospital smells and the first time he had taken a shaky breath and whispered, "Mama." As I spoke, she listened in silence, not with pity but with attention. When I finished, her hand found mine and squeezed it like an anchor. "You gave him life," she said plainly, "and you don't deserve this. Nobody does." The words were small and ordinary. They steadied me more than anything since I had been thrown into the street. But she did more than speak. She asked questions in the practical, tidy way social workers do. Did I have paperwork? Do I remember the surgeon's name? Are there records of the transplant? Did anyone at the hospital witness me signing consent? At first, I had thought those papers were the only things I had left. My tin, the faded bills, a photograph of my husband. I had never considered that the hospital itself held a chronicle of my sacrifice, Aisha explained. Medical records document donors and recipients. Consent forms are signed and time-stamped, and the transplant team keeps logs of who was assessed and when. Those files could show, in cold, indisputable ink, that I had indeed donated a kidney. "Would you let me help you?" she asked, as if the offer were simply practical. She didn't rush me. She didn't clothe the help in rhetoric. She made a plan, shelter for the night. Then the clinic the next morning to request access to donor records. Then a counselor. Then a lawyer the clinic recommended for elder abuse and medical legal matters. She arranged a room at a nearby transitional shelter that afternoon, clean sheets, a hot meal, a small locker where I could keep my tin and my prayer beads. The shelter director, who knew her, smiled when she mentioned the transplant clinic. The door opened for me wide enough that it felt like a small miracle. The next morning, Aisha took me to the hospital. The receptionists knew her. She had been there so often that the staff began to treat her like part of their furniture, steady, useful, present. She helped me sit in a wheelchair when my knees trembled and guided me to the transplant office, where a nurse recognized the donor name and, after a brief conversation and a confidentiality check, agreed to pull my file. When the solitudes of bureaucracy opened, I felt as if the world itself had shifted on its hinges. The records were clinical and at first sight dry. Surgery notes, consent forms, pre-op evaluations, post-op nursing charts, but each line was a testament. There it was, my signature on the consent form, the surgeon's initials, the cross-match results that proved we were compatible. There was the post-op note. Donor stable, discharged on day X with instructions for follow-up, advised regarding lifestyle changes. There were also entries from the transplant social worker noting family dynamics, assessed donor to be provided with postoperative supports. Reading the words felt like watching a clock reverse. The proof that I had given life was now written in the hospital's own hand. Aisha photocopied everything with professional quiet. "This will help," she said, tapping the pages. "Not just to prove you were a donor, but to show what was promised: follow-up care, counseling, assessment of donor risk. If family support was part of your discharge plan and it wasn't followed through, or if you were forced out, that's a breach, and it matters legally." She also asked me for the names of neighbors, the tin box, anything I remembered that could be corroborated. I felt small describing these details, as if I were rolling out evidence from a life that should have been private. But she never flinched. Instead, she wrote carefully, like someone building a map that could guide me home. A week turned into another. Aisha connected me with a transplant social worker, who arranged for medical follow-up I could get even without stable housing, blood tests, blood pressure monitoring, checkups to assess how my remaining kidney was functioning. The kindness of that coordination mattered in ways that were practical and profound. For the first time, someone was treating my health as their business, not as an inconvenience. But she did more than arrange doctors and photocopies. She listened to me when my grief swelled about the boy who had been my son turning away, about the nights under awnings and the bread that was sometimes cold. She helped me understand my rights. The hospital had a duty of care to assess the donor's safety, and community services might step in when a vulnerable adult is abandoned. At her suggestion, we filed a report with Adult Protective Services, not an accusation so much as an alert that a vulnerable donor had been left without promised postoperative supports. The kindness of the stranger became, slowly, the scaffolding for action. She introduced me to a lawyer at a nonprofit legal clinic who specialized in elder issues and medical legal cases. The lawyer's eyes were sharp when she heard the facts: a documented transplant, consent forms, notes about planned post-donation supports, and a sudden family abandonment. "This isn't only a moral wrong," she said. "There are elements here: breach of duty, potential elder abuse, neglect that can be pursued." I sat there, the photocopies like talismans in my lap, and felt something that had been absent since the wedding: possibility. Not a naive hope, but the steady, narrowing focus of a plan. A woman I didn't owe, whom I had never met before the bus stop, had stepped into my life and refused to let me be invisible. That evening, as I tucked my tin box into the small locker in the shelter, I pressed the paper copies to my chest. They were only paper, yet more alive than words. They could speak when my voice faltered. I thought of the nights of pain, of the hospital lights, of my son's whisper. I thought of the warmth in Aisha's eyes and the efficient calm of the social worker who had arranged the lab tests. For the first time in weeks, I slept without the raw ache that had become my nightly companion. It was not that my troubles had vanished. My body still ached. My future was uncertain, but a hand had reached in, quiet, competent, resolute, and that hand had begun to pull the loose threads of my life back into a rope I could climb. When dawn came, gray and patient, I dressed slowly and took the copies with me like a small army. The path ahead would be hard courtrooms, statements, tests, the slow-minded grind of justice, but I was no longer alone on it. The kindness of a stranger had become the hinge on which my life might swing back toward dignity. And in the hush of that morning, I let myself believe something I had not permitted since the wedding. Perhaps there would be a reckoning after all. With Aisha's help, I met a lawyer at a small legal clinic. She flipped through my hospital records, my consent forms, and the witness notes Aisha had gathered. Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't just family cruelty," she said firmly. "This is neglect and elder abuse. We can build a case." Hearing those words felt like breathing after drowning. For weeks, I had been called a burden, unwanted, useless. Now, finally, someone said aloud what I had known in my heart: I was wronged. The lawyer began preparing the case. She gathered medical records, hospital notes, even the surgeon's testimony. Neighbors who knew my story agreed to speak. Every paper, every voice, became a brick in the wall of truth we were building. For the first time since my son had pushed me out, I felt my back straighten. The same hands that had once signed my kidney away now signed affidavits and statements. This time, I wasn't giving life away, I was fighting to reclaim my dignity. The road ahead would be hard, but the battle had begun. And this time, I wasn't alone. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence when my case was called. I sat at the front beside my lawyer, clutching the folder of documents Aisha had helped me gather. My son and his wife sat across the room. He looked down, avoiding my eyes, but she held her chin high, her arrogance sharp as a blade. The judge asked my lawyer to begin. Calmly, she laid out the facts: a mother who donated her kidney, medical records proving the surgery, consent forms with my signature, and reports that after the transplant, I was abandoned and thrown into the streets. Each document was handed to the judge, each line of evidence read aloud like an accusation. Then came the witnesses. The surgeon confirmed, yes, Odessa donated her kidney to her son. She saved his life. A social worker added, we noted in her file that she would need family support during recovery. Neighbors testified to. One spoke of seeing me collapse outside the house. Another recalled the shouting that forced me out. When it was the turn of my son's wife, she tried to twist the story. She's lying, she said sharply. She gave the kidney, yes, but afterward she just became lazy, always pretending to be sick. We couldn't live like that. The judge's expression hardened. Pretending? He asked. Do you mean to say a 60-year-old woman with one kidney, signed hospital documents, went through surgery, and is now suffering the aftereffect? For attention, her silence was answer enough. The eyes of the courtroom turned toward me. Then I rose slowly, leaning on the table for strength, and said, I gave him life twice, once in birth, once with my kidney. I never asked for anything in return, only respect and care. But instead, I was told I am a burden, thrown out like trash. That is my truth. The room was quiet. Even my son lifted his head, his face pale with shame. For the first time since that cruel night, I felt the power of truth filling the silence. The courtroom was tense when the judge finally returned with his decision. Everyone sat still: lawyers, witnesses, even strangers who had come to watch. My son's wife fidgeted nervously, but my son sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge's voice was steady, every word falling like a hammer. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds that Odessa did indeed donate her kidney to save her son's life. Medical records, witness testimony, and hospital files confirm her sacrifice. What followed was not gratitude, but abandonment, humiliation, and neglect. Such actions are not only immoral, they are unlawful. He paused, the silence in the room heavy. This court recognizes Odessa as the rightful victim of elder abuse. Her rights and dignity have been violated. Therefore, immediate legal protection is granted. Further action will be taken against those responsible. The gavel struck, echoing through the chamber. My eyes filled with tears, but they were not the tears of weakness I had shed on the streets. These were tears of justice. The world had finally spoken for me. I turned slightly, just enough to see my son. His shoulders slumped, his face pale with shame. His wife's arrogance was gone, replaced by fear and fury she could no longer hide. For months, I had been invisible, cast aside as a burden. But here, in this courtroom, my sacrifice was named, my pain acknowledged, and my dignity restored. Justice had spoken, and it was louder than betrayal. The verdict spread quickly beyond the courtroom. By evening, neighbors, relatives, even strangers in the marketplace were whispering the story. The mother who gave her kidney to her son, only to be thrown out when she grew weak, and who stood in court to reclaim her dignity. My son and his wife returned home, not to applause, but to shame. Relatives stopped visiting, friends avoided them. Even at his workplace, people whispered behind his back, shaking their heads in disgust. His wife, once proud and arrogant, found doors closing in her face. Invitations stopped. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered. Inside their house, the tension grew heavy. The same walls they had once filled with laughter now echoed with blame. She accused him. This is your fault. We could have been free of her. He snapped back. If you hadn't slapped her, if you hadn't pushed so hard, we wouldn't be here. Their unity, built on greed, began to crumble. Meanwhile, the court arranged protective support for me. With Aisha's help, I found a small but warm place to live, and regular checkups for my health were scheduled. People who once looked at me with pity now looked at me with respect. Some even called me courageous. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, but finally seen. The cruel irony was clear. The kidney I had given brought my son back to life, but the betrayal had destroyed the life he tried to rebuild. He had health, but no peace. He had a house, but no respect. Everywhere he went, he carried the label of the ungrateful son who betrayed his mother. And as for me, I no longer wished for his apology. I no longer longed for his embrace. What I had gained back was far greater: my voice, my dignity, and the knowledge that the truth had triumphed over cruelty. The consequences were not just legal, they were written into every look of disgust he received, every door that closed, every whisper that followed them. That was their punishment, to live in the shadow of their own shame. When the noise of the courtroom faded, and the gossip of the streets grew quieter, I finally found myself sitting in peace. The small room where I now lived was modest: just a bed, a chair, and a window that let in the morning light, but it felt warmer than the grand house I had once built. Warm, because this place was mine, and because my dignity lived here with me. I often thought back to the journey, the night I rushed my sick son to the hospital, the moment I signed away my health for his life. The joy of seeing him recover, and then the slow pain of my own decline. I remembered the words that had cut deeper than knives: "You're a burden." And I remembered the rain as I walked away from the house that had once been my home. But I also thought of Aisha, the stranger who became my ally, of the lawyer who fought for me, of the witnesses who spoke truth in court. They reminded me that even when those closest to you betray you, the world can still hold unexpected kindness. The greatest lesson of all was this: love should never be blind to sacrifice is sacred, but it must never strip you of your worth. I gave my son life twice, but in doing so, I nearly lost my own soul to despair. Only by standing up, only by demanding justice, did I reclaim myself. And so, my story ends not with bitterness, but with strength. My son may carry his shame, his wife may live in scorn, but I live with truth. The world knows what I endured, and I know that even in the darkest nights, a spark of justice can still burn. The lesson I carry is simple, and I whisper it like a prayer: never let your sacrifice erase your dignity. Protect your heart, your voice, and your worth even when giving everything. Because dignity, once restored, is the greatest victory of all.